It's Saturday or Sunday, February 25th or 26th, depending on what continent you're on. We're doing the Bucky call this weekend. For those of you who miss out on this first few minutes of just chatting along, I totally apologize. We've had so much fun, but now we're about to start the call. So, John Butler, how are you feeling today, and what do you expect to get out of the call?
I'm feeling great. Very, very grateful to be in Perth. We went to a function on Friday night. We're looking out over the river towards the park and the city, and just thinking how incredibly fortunate we are in so many ways to live in Perth with everything else that's happening in the world. So I start off by being very grateful. I've had my walk in the park, so I'm feeling good about that, and we've got a few jobs done. So I'm looking forward to different sort of thinking to what I experienced during the week, wrapping my brain around Bucky and his concepts, which is always a bit of a stretch, so it must be good for me. And hopefully by the end of our call, I'll know just a little bit more. So that's where I'm at. Susan, how do you feel, and what do you hope to take out of today?
I feel very fortunate to be with you all, and I am just excited to kind of stretch out to broader perspective. And I know you all are very good at helping me to do that. I've read Grunch of Giants in the past, but doing it solo is completely different than doing it with compatriots. So thank you. Manu, how are you feeling? What are you looking for today?
I'm feeling nice. I'm feeling good. It's really a nice morning. It's still a little bit past 5 a.m. here. But as John says, we're in the same, how do you call it? Same latitudes. And I expect to have, a good time. It's going to be a nice time in Cape Town. Otherwise, I'm grateful. And really, what I expect is that, Susan, is that this Grunch of Giant, reading it again, just give me a new perspective. And that new perspective in relationship with what is going on in the world today is very, very educative. That's where I stand, at the confluence of those, at least two flows. And I just expect that there's going to be a lot, as it has been experienced in the past few weeks. There's going to be a lot. That's my expectation. Joe, how do you feel? What do you expect? I know you're sick, but
yeah, I'm sick. Not feeling too well, sick to my stomach. And I'm guessing I ate something. I'm hoping that's it. I'm hoping it's nothing more than that. But I'm starting to feel better ever since I see you guys. So so it's good to be out of bed and not dwelling on my not feeling well. My expectation is to continue to kind of read through this with a group is a privilege, and I am feeling privileged to be here with everybody. But it's a privilege, and this is a book that you have to go through a couple times. It's not something that you go through once. So it's a privilege to be able to go through it with everyone. I'm looking to just continue down the road of understanding the roots of our economic systems, and I'll leave it there. Steve, how do you feel, my friend? What do you want to take away from today?
Well, I too, with you guys, I'm excited. To me, these Bucky calls are like, they're like going to church. I mean, it's when I get to talk about what's going on around me at a different level of consciousness than just simply reacting and taking sides and voting for a team. It's like looking at Bucky's introduced me to this word topology, and I'm just having I'm just having an amazing experience looking at what a thing is really, instead of just reacting to it. And so these calls are just really, really good for me. And I'm just delighted to be here. And, as you guys have all said here, one way or another, to share, to read the book all by myself is one thing, but to read and then hear your guys' responses and your reactions is a wonderful thing. The U.S. is gradually moving into a presidential election, and And I've been, for some reason, I hooked into Marianne Williams. I think that's her name. It could be Williamson. But anyway, she's a Course on Miracles teacher, been that for decades. And she ran as in the Democratic Party ticket as a presidential candidate in 2020. And she's I think she's announcing her candidacy now in the US. And the way she looks at things is just completely different. And the whole thing brings me back to Bucky's Grunch of Giants and how Bucky wrote, this is a book 20 years after he wrote about what was going on and how corporations were taking over the world. He writes this book 20 years later and says, well, if you want to know what progress have been made, all you got to do is look at the skylines of these cities over the last 25 years. They just gotten bigger. Like the humanity has put their money into their buildings and their things. And I don't think it's about an either or. I think we can build our things and have nice things, and we can take care of ourselves. And this whole idea of how do I take care of myself, and how do I become accountable for my experience and responsible for my experience, and I think that's what the invitation of this Bucky reading is all about. And so so this is a challenge and a wonderful opportunity to look inside one more time. So I'm expecting to get a whole lot out of this. Now we're going to continue with Bucky, and I've got the reading up here ready to go. And whoops, that's the wrong field. We were down towards the end of page 32, but I think if we start right here with when the automobiles will be in good shape. Now, John, when you weren't here, we were rotating around reading, and I don't want to overdo you, but if you care to read.
I'm happy to read.
All right, good. We're happy.
Okay.
So
when the automobiles and the auto trucks took so much business from the railways as to render the railroad passenger systems profitless, and cross-country pipeline petroleum replaced coal as a prime fuel, and giant transoceanic tankers were developed, and the Middle East oil lands were explored and developed, the petroleum business rose swiftly to become the maximum economic power giant of the 20th century, outpowering the Morgan utilities and banks-based system. The number of kilowatts of electric energy being generated from each British thermal unit of fossil fuels burned, or foot-pounds per second of water power-derived turbine.
there we go.
Functioning has continually increased since the very beginnings of electric power generation and distribution. Concurrently, the weight of the production and distribution equipment to produce that power rapidly decreased per each kilowatt or horsepower of energy produced and delivered. As a consequence of this never-ceasing technological increase in overall efficiency, the actual overall cosmically predicated costs of energy generation have always and only decreased, and cost increases have been the consequence of those in top power positions contriving through pricing to be able to pay ever greater dividends to shareholders, and thus to increase the stock market value of their own shares, thus in turn to increase their power to control the amassed money of others as capital. Such capital power manipulation is intoxicating and seemingly unchallengeable. However, as with all socio-economic and political power evolution, the politically appointed public service commissions in all the states have consistently granted even higher kilowatt-hour price rates to the privately owned, deceptively named public service companies producing the electric power. So unchallengeably powerful are the public service commissions that in 1981 and 1982, they have been able to allow great utility companies to abandon some $900 million wasted by utility companies as they abandon their partially finished atomic energy plants on the US West Coast, charging the loss to the consumers by increasing their rates. This results in private enterprise making a $900 million bad gamble and having the capability of passing on their loss to the public.
Okay, let's pause there for a second.
Whoa.
What did he just say there in that last paragraph? In the paragraph prior, he seems to be applauding, or at least noting, the ephemeralization of efficiency of generating so many, power, BTUs, as we shifted from coal to oil, and how those infrastructures were built to do that. and then he starts talking about public utilities and public services. What's he saying there in that last paragraph?
That those in control of energy have been able to gamble, for example, by moving into nuclear energy and then not being able to follow through and passing on the $900 million loss to the consumers of energy. It's business not taking responsibility. It's the same thing as business not being accountable, business being bailed out by the government.
And the thing
were
he
talking
points
about it
out
last week.
is these businesses are deceptively named public service companies,
Yeah,
which is interesting because there's supposed to be a public service commission where they're supposed to bring their wage hikes to the people, the board of directors, and they're supposed to look at that and make sure there's a minimum amount of profit being made so that the public is served. But somehow they hid $900 million worth of bad investments on atomic fuel. Does anybody know how that happened? I hadn't heard of that.
No, I have not.
Yeah.
was that following 3 Mile Island?
It said it's 1981 and 1982. So there's
What year was 3 Mile Island?
It was right around that time.
Well, I've got the
Because once 3 Mile Island happened, that was the end of, in fact,
3 Mile
GE
Island.
was in the middle of building a nuclear power plant in the Philippines. And the
Yeah.
moment 3 Mile Island happened, the Philippines government ordered them out. There's an unfinished nuclear power station sitting in the Philippines.
Yeah, Google says that March 28th in 1979 is when the 3 Mile Island reactor.
That'd be right. Yep, that'd be right.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
Following that, if they were building other nuclear power stations, they had to halt.
Yeah, that's right next to Joe's house there.
Right.
Joe, how did you feel with 3 Mile Island? How close were you to that all?
I don't think he was alive, Steve.
Oh, that's right, 79. I'm so sorry. Damn. I was an old fart by then. Somehow age doesn't have any, I don't get it. Okay, good. Any other comments or notations on what we've just been reading?
Yes,
It's
I
just
think
disgusting. It's
Yeah, Manu?
yes, I think there's another perspective to this, which is much more, in my opinion, more insightful. He's talking here about inflation and inflation as a theft. And what I read is that there is ephemeralization that ought to have been translated into better condition of living, cheaper, because everything more is done with less. But it's been kind of the profit that I realize are captured by some, let's just say some people at the top, and they transform the game into a financial game. You realize that you start having a lot of mergers and acquisitions and things like that. That is my interpretation of abandoning things unfinished and charging the consumer. The whole purpose of MMAs and is to prop up the share value, which has very little to do with the public good, or let us say the public good, but the larger good that the utility or the company or whatever was trying to achieve. And that is sold to people like that. So there is theft that is organized, that is illegal, and that theft is called inflation. Inflation is created via money flows, via money creation from thin air to prop some things. It's like you have a big balloon and you are locally blowing part of it and distorting completely the signals in the market. I don't know if anybody also sees it like that reading this.
I agree with you, Manu. And I think it raises a macro question, a very important one, that, what's the role, that the government and private industry plays in bringing us energy.
Yeah.
And it's very, it's the one thing is clear is that this is not working, at least for everyone. And I noted the cosmic, what was it, predicated cost, I think. I don't know, maybe in the previous paragraphs, I've always gone down, but that certainly isn't true for the consumer. So there's also a very interesting economist out of London, I think, but who talks about public-private partnerships quite a lot, but and talks about this, the government's only, unfortunately, the government's only role at this point has been de-risking markets for companies, and hasn't necessarily focused on making sure that things that profits and whatever is left over is distributed evenly. I'll leave it at that.
Mm.
I heard this morning on a program called On the Media. It gave a history. It was kind of like talking about the neo-communist movement and capitalism versus communism over the century. And it talked about how there were corporate movements that began in the late 1800s that were pro-corporate industrialization, and they were against any kind of governmental restriction whatsoever. They were even pro-child labor. They argued that it was okay for a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old to be working in a coal mine or in some kind of industry, because that was freedom, that capitalism is about freedom. And if you restrict capitalism, you restrict freedom, and that democracy and capitalism are, they're synonymous. And how these movements, even labor unions came up and started moving against that, but that these capitalist arguments filtered down through, and these guys actually funded universities. They took these capitalist guys and paid the university to let them be teachers, and that evolved into the Milton Friedman thing. If you guys remember Milton Friedman, and it even talked about Ronald Reagan, who was kind of like suffering as an actor. He wasn't getting good parts, and then he became the host on General Electric Something Hour. And at the beginning and end of those things, he would have this statement that would be pro-Milton Friedman, pro-corporation, anti-labor. And here was a guy who was actually president of the Actors Labor Union, of the Actors Guild, but then was so indoctrinated by all this stuff that when he was president and the Federal Aviation Commission, the FAA, those guys were overworked and going crazy. They struck, and he broke that union and completely broke the union, which shocked the crap out of everybody. I voted for Reagan because he was the head of the labor union. I thought, here's a guy who could kind of stand a middle ground. And this whole idea of this propaganda machine that had built, that's over 100 years old, that evolved into the Milton Friedman thing. And every guy that, I mean, from Ben Shapiro, you talk to any conservative, they always talk about Milton Friedman. But if you look at where he came from, these guys were pro child labor. It boggles the mind, and how the US has allowed itself, and maybe the free world has allowed itself, to be indoctrinated by these ideas. Wow. I didn't have any idea that what I was listening to this morning was going to have anything to do with this, but here we go. Any other comments or questions? That's On the Media. I'm going to go listen to that program again. It was just, I happened to have to get up early to take my grandson to something, and in the car, and I was listening to this program, and it blew my mind. I didn't realize how corporations created propaganda to support this idea that capitalism is freedom, and to restrict capitalism is communistic. It's to restrict freedom. Weird. And the words have been intermingled. Anyway, that's what I got out of
Those
today.
same companies may be standing in Russia today and
Right.
have the reverse message that freedom is communism.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the global elite are not constrained by national borders.
Yeah. They're called,
Yes.
Putin calls the Ukrainians fascists, and that these Western fascist interests are trying to undermine the freedom of Russia. Yeah. If I heard you right, I think I just agreed with you, Susan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions? Okay, let's proceed.
Now, did we read that last sentence or that paragraph that began the constant fundamental operating cost reductions?
I think we need to read that paragraph.
I think we need to read it. The constant fundamental operating cost reductions combined with constant price increases have produced so much money that the power generating businesses are amongst the wealthiest and most invisible of all the politically manipulative organisations. After World War II, the electric power industry's 3/4 of a century accumulated wealth successfully combined its political power with that of the oil giants to take over for nothing the total atomic energy program assets. This included all of the know-how and production apparatus of the US government's military atomic energy program, for which development the US citizens had paid $150 billion.
Yeah.
Here, have it for free. This amassing of political power coincided with a generally dawning awareness of US youth in general, and an ever-increasing percentage of the mature US electorate regarding the corruption of the political representatives of their theretofore trusted democratic government. This corruptibility is inherent in the fact that the TV electronic campaign costs of a US election now amount to $50 million for the presidency. I'll bet it's a lot higher than that now. $10 million for a senator and $5 million for a congressional seat. This corruptibility is enhanced by the US Supreme Court's hang fire no ruling of 1981, which will allow unlimited money to be spent in the next election years. The now gone supranational corporate giants have always known that the fossil fuels can and will become exhausted. To meet this contingency, their post-World War II last third of a century grand strategy has been to force the US government to develop superior atomic war capability knowing full well that atomic warfare will terminate human occupancy of planet Earth, which fact would eventually force the government to abandon its war use. First and foremost, however, the power monopoly would have to have accomplished their public service atomic energy objective first of becoming contractors to operate government atomic facilities. Second, of siphoning off from the US government all the latter's atomic scientist personnel and all the invisible know-how to develop world-around atomic energy plants to feed into their wired and metered energy monopoly system as the petroleum source diminished and approached depletion. In the meantime, while maintaining their power over the USA and other political systems, their grand strategy found it necessary to have the USA and Western world population satisfied that the USA was successfully maintaining its fighting superiority over the USSR by producing more atomic bombs than the Russians. Look at us now. To initiate his wired and metered electric energy power monopoly in the gay 90s, 1890, which 3/4 of a century later became an overwhelming socio-economic power, the elder J.P. Morgan used the earlier formula of issuing bonds and preferred stocks on each of his enterprises as soon as they are paying dividends. It was thus provided with additional free capital to initiate other branches of the power structure system, for example, in copper mining for use in the generation and conduction of electric power, steel manufacture, for the high line masts and structural housings of the electric equipment, etc.
Let's pause right there for a second.
Yeah, okay.
Back previously here, he said that the US elections were $50 million for the presidency. I turned my microphone off and I checked with Google. In our last election cycle, presidential candidates raised and spent $4.1 billion in 24
Whoa.
in the 2019 to 2020 election cycle. according to finance reports filed with the Federal Elections Commission that cover activity from January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2020, $4.1 billion.
You know, it would be interesting to see how much money is on both sides,
Hmm.
how much money is being funded or is funding both sides, you know, the same, and, you know,
That happens in Australia.
Yeah. And, you know, I was listening today, you know, the money is, the corporations are into both the Democrats and the Republicans. We have this duopoly in America.
yeah.
So we don't have a, you know, fragmented groups that have to create a coalition to get anything done. We just have this duopoly, and they're all funded. They're both funded by these corporations. Is to have any other conversation is impossible. Any other comments or questions?
Do you know what is called to hedge? Plain vanilla? See?
What's that?
To hedge.
To hedge.
If I'm, you know, that is you hedge on
You
the
hedge-
upside
You
and the
had to,
downside. Yes. So the political party, they win. If you remember, one of, I think it was on the Grunch of Giants, it's a 5-4 foam, head or tail, we win. Remember that?
Yeah,
I'm not
I do. I it was either Grunch of Giants or Utopian or Oblivion. It's one of the two.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Probably it was the Grunch. I'm getting confused now, but Bucky talks very much about whatever outcome, I place myself to win. I'm talking to this in reaction to what Steve said, that both the Democratic and the Republican parties in the US seem to be like captured by capital, isn't it?
yeah.
Is that what you said?
It was Grunch of the Giants. It's in the beginning, Manu. I shouldn't have doubted you. Sorry.
Well, and
Right. And then I had a second comment. We spoke, I don't know when, about measuring price increase by the index of household cost, 1937 to 2021. And then we saw 1937, 2000, and 2021. And that index, that was basically what was required if you took the base, what is it, cost of a single family, and then household cost divided by income, but household income. If you take a single home, here I have household cost divided by the income. You have as an index in 2000, it was 2.83. So it costs about 3 times the income of a household to purchase a home. In 2021, that ratio is 7 and 7.90. Let's just say 8. So if you're taking that and you're looking at that price at the cost of the election of US president, it can give you an indication of how inflated it's become.
yeah.
It was interesting. I remember distinctly Mitt Romney saying during a presidential campaign, "Well, we need to get prices of homes back up." And I was like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's like, you need to make them affordable.
Yeah.
A huge distinction between those two, because, you know, we just had the crash. And so he was like, you know, prices of homes, you know, he was running in 2012. Anyway.
Yeah, we talked last week or the week before about the Glass-Steagall Act, and the fact that how it was evoked at the time of the crash in the 1920s, and then had slowly been dismantled starting with Reagan in the 70s. And then in 2008, we had the big crash. So the Frank Dodd Act was supposed to replace Glass-Steagall and didn't even get freaking close. And what happened in 2008 was banks continued to be able to buy up commodities. And so these hedge funds under Wall Street are buying up houses, competing with investors, competing with home people, and they're creating a short supply of houses available to buy and driving the prices up. So American people are competing with our own banks for places to live.
But there is a contradiction here. How comes it that there is ephemeralization, that is lower cost per unit output, right?
Yeah.
And then there is this inflation.
Yeah.
The two don't sit together.
Well,
Something's happening in the system.
Yeah, he's pointing out here that the ephemeralization has been sucked up by into corporate profits.
Right.
That all the efficiencies are just being sucked up by the rich guys.
Wow. Another interesting point is that you could just substitute technology for petroleum companies in the context of today, and you will still read this text clearly, and they will tell you the same story of what's happening.
Right on.
Because I mean, look at the NASA. What is happening to NASA in the US?
And pilfered.
Yeah, all of the scientists have been poached. The American taxpayer funded all of these programs, and it's now in private hands of so powerful people that they think like they're going to go and isolate themselves on Mars, isolate themselves from the Earthian problems.
Okay. Shall we continue?
Yep.
Okay. I think we're right there with the blue highlight is, right?
Right. Yes. He used his engineering firm of Stone Webster to design and build his foreign country power systems operated by Electric Bond and Share Company, EBASCO. His price increasing by the power companies was automatically matched by increase in the stock market sale of his company's shares. These share values increased with his own equities advance. Using these equities as capital, he opened his own banks. Because his enterprising monopolies earned good dividends, shares in his companies became increasingly popular. His own bank and the banks he controlled opened brokerage departments. He backed the opening of many stock exchange seat-owning individuals' brokerage houses to cope with the increasing complexity of open market selling and buying all of his company's shares or bonds. By the time of the 1929 crash, Morgan was controlling the boards of directors of General Electric, General Motors, US Steel, the big three copper companies, the telephone and telegraph companies, all the Edison Power, public utilities, etc., and many of the US banks. At the outset, Morgan's partners gave Harvard University its law and business schools, from whose highly educated specialized graduates they recruited the army of lawyers and financial experts to service their Wall Street offices. This legal army handled the behind-the-scenes complex contractings and financial paperwork implementing Morgan's and his associates' enterprises. There being no laws against so doing prior to 1929, he used general bank deposits to underwrite his enterprises. In the early 1920s, the Morgan-dominated banking system pushed farm machinery sales to farmers on time payment plans secured to the banks by first mortgages on the farm properties as well as on the machinery. As I explained in Critical Path, the bad hog market of 1926 hit farmers financially, causing many of them to be unable to make their monthly payments on their time purchased farm machinery. The country banks not only replevened, I think it means repossessed, the machinery, but foreclosed on the farms, which were mortgaged to guarantee the time payments. The country banks found the farms unsaleable as there were no other USA individuals eager to go into farming. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris World War I song? Then the bigger city banks, which had loaned the small banks money based on the soundness of physical land and machine collateral, foreclosed on the small country banks. The larger city banks also found their foreclosure properties unsaleable. No cash funds were available to accommodate their depositors' withdrawals. Runs on banks multiplied. There came a crisis moment when over 5,000 banks closed in one day. Finally, the big Chicago banks closed and only the big New York banks remained open. Then it was discovered that they too, having loaned their deposits for industrial ventures, now lacked cash monies with which to fund their depositors, and the New Deal and FDR declared the bank moratorium, thereby avoiding admitting the bankruptcy of the US banking system, and with it the end of US capitalism. The US Congress, inquiring exhaustively into the matter, found that those New York banks' brokerage departments had been using deposits for underwriting venture industries. Because this was at the heart of the failure, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act of 1933 was enacted permanently, it was hoped, separating venture broking underwriting from the New Deal government's guaranteed bank deposits of the people. JP Morgan Sr.'s strategy of organisation of the financing and control of US industrial development was evolved from his close cooperation with the Bank of England's centuries-old behind-the-scenes laws of accepted precedent of physical property rights and their convertibility into paper securities as marketable shares in enterprise. The Bank of England and Morgan nurtured the young Grunch of 18th century giants from their youth into lusty 19th century colonial maturity. JP Morgan became the official fiscal agent of the British Empire in World War I. As the Allies' purchasing agent from 1914 to 1918, Morgan's amassing in the US of the profits of World War I shifted the world capital of the Grunch of corporate giants from Europe to America, and until the 1929 crash, assured Morgan's dominance of the socio-economic evolutionary balance of power over human affairs on planet Earth. How scary.
Yeah.
The Russian Revolution brought about the 1917 inception of the USSR and its organisation of world communism as the evolutionary challenge to capitalism's power. In Critical Path, I have traced these evolutionary events to 1981. In 1981, the supranational invisible money-making colossus funds, itself faced with the USSR's 1981 superiority in numbers of conventionally armed divisions and greater all-oceans naval power than that possessed by the US and its NATO allies. US Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger admitted in April 1981 the extraordinary Soviet military buildup, which has left in its wake US loss of strategic defense advantage, which it had maintained in the 50s and 60s. He cites Defense Department data showing the Soviets 4-to-1 advantage in tanks, their 2-to-1 tactical advantage in atomic-powered atomic missile launching submarines, and a 4-to-1 advantage in submarines, and in addition, the sizable increase in the weight and accuracy of their nuclear intercontinental strategic missiles. He describes their naval build-up as the fastest in naval history. Weinberger states that at present, the USSR continues to outbuild the US 2-to-1 in surface vessels and 5-to-1 in submarines, according to his latest figures. Jane's annual publications of international armaments have been providing these figures quite accurately over the years, with no mention of them by the petro-atomic power structure puppet of US politicians, and even less mentioned by the supranational giants-controlled US press.
Comments, questions?
What corruption? What
There's a lot
destruction?
covered. Yeah, there's a lot to cover there,
Oh.
especially.
Is
Yeah.
is it worth a conversation? It's overwhelming to me.
Farmers losing their farms because they were conned into taking on finance they should never have touched.
Yeah.
And
Some
the
things
just
don't change.
unquenchable thirst for money and power of Morgan.
In the 1980s is also when the US had a state savings. Up until the 1980s, most of the banks that functioned within the states were regulated by the states. And when Reagan came in, and up to that time, they gradually deregulated the US Wall Street and basically made some laws that were adverse to state banks. And so the state banks started going bankrupt, which meant that the US, the big banks, the Wall Street banks could take over the state banks. That occurred in the 80s. He'll probably talk about it here again, but like 7,000 savings and loans in America went bankrupt, and the US created a thing called the RTC, our Trust Corporation. What was it called? Anyway, so that the state
Reclamation Trust.
yeah. Say it
Was it
again, Joe.
Reclamation Trust.
Reclamation Trust Corporation. So the state chartered banks who had all these mortgages, those banks went bankrupt because they changed the tax rules on them. And so they had to close down. They had to sell their mortgages off to Wall Street. And, you know, Americans just let it go. They just let it, 7,000 local banks went bankrupt, and the banking system shifted in the 80s. That's when all this stuff is going on.
And perception is just so powerful, because I was a kid during that time, and it was definitely painted in a way that I got the feeling sense that it was the fault or the greed or some elemental badness of those savings and loan companies.
Yeah.
And that the big national branches of banks were the saviors of everything.
Yeah. I was a real estate agent at the time, actively as a real estate agent. I was doing real estate seminars in the early 80s. And I watched this savings and loan thing go on, and the creation of the RTC, and how the feds just took over all these properties. And they did it in the 80s. They did it again in 2008 with the crash. Just continually cycling through.
Well, it happens in every profession. So I wasn't out of school yet, but there used to be a time where, as a doctor, you could write off the cost of care you gave away for free to defer your taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And that became, in a stroke of a pen, became illegal, and changed everything about what the financial reality was for another group of professionals, the not lawyers group of professionals.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. That adds to my complaints about the US healthcare system. You know?
There's a lot.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions?
It's just so scary
Yeah.
to bail out the powerful and to take away from, I wouldn't say the meek, whatever was left, that will allow that meek to do something that is of better societal benefit. Because that incentive with doctors to kind of write off some time that is spent. I didn't get very much what you say. Spend doing what, Susan?
So there's very frequently, when I take call, whoever walks in, I take care of. I don't ask them how they're going to pay. I don't ask them if they're going to pay. And basically, I assume that if they don't have insurance, nobody can afford a hospital stay. But I don't get to write my time expenditures, because it costs my practice money to administer that care. It costs me liability, but I don't get to write that off as a business loss.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they just changed the rules and got access to, more money, more taxable money.
And then combine that with the fact that you as a doctor are constantly on that fence between big pharma and good health, and the threat of being sued if you do one or the other, right? If you don't offer that person that pill, then they can sue you.
Well, I know that we're talking about JP Morgan here and his overwhelming, but it was one of his compatriots, the Rockefellers, who took over the education and then all the business parts of medicine, starting with a report written by a sociologist in 1910. And after that report on medical education in the United States, that was used as the basis to change over and retool all the medical schools. And it turns out that the Rockefellers had oil interests. Almost all of the initial pharma medications were derivatives from coal tar. So they guided, if you're doing something that works by, using cold therapy or sunshine or laying on of hands, whatever, anything that wasn't their product got to be moved into not only irrelevant, but dangerous. So it's happened in a lot of industries. I'm sure.
How does the world wake up to this?
Bucky said that, very few people were spontaneously arousable, meaning that in their own capacity of their own brain mind that can start to see the relationships between this. We're really
many are uneducated, many are intimidated, and many are just struggling to survive anyway and don't feel they have the time or energy or ability to challenge huge vested interests.
Well, and I think that got proved with COVID. When the lockdown came, there were a lot of people who found out they didn't need to play those games. And so all of a sudden things are kind of upside down.
Well, there are a lot of emails circulating about corruption at every level, including companies that produce the vaccines and those, the profits they've made out of it and the funding by governments. And
I heard a recent report that there's a study going on in Europe and all these other countries, including the US, where they're comparing just natural immunity to the vaccine lockdown scenario, and natural immunity was absolutely the same. That if it just let the disease run its course, we wouldn't have had all these adverse effects by shutting down schools and creating all this depression and, the breaking of the chains of the supply chains for our industry. I hope that some of that research gets out and gets into the public eye, because
but there's also the long-term effects. I mean, there's long COVID. We don't have any idea what the long-term effects will be of COVID vaccinations.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
We don't have any idea what the long-term effect will be of COVID vaccinations.
Yeah, I was gonna say, give me long COVID all day long as a real damned infection. They injected things into our bodies without even revealing what compounds they were, because they were proprietary. And, just a huge transfer of public dollars to private corporations.
Yeah.
At a tremendous cost.
Morgan would have been proud of them.
Yeah, we don't know what it'll be.
Yeah. Other comments, questions? All righty. Do you want to continue reading?
Yes, we were at the end of that page, I think.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yep. We read the
Next
last
page.
paragraph on the page.
All right.
To regain its military edge, détente, over the Soviet Union, if it can be done at all, and assuming that the USSR does nothing to offset the attempt, it will take 10 years, and according to Defense Secretary Weinberger, 1.6 trillion, or approximately $1 billion a day, 365 billion a year, over the next 5 years, just for starters. The supranational money colossus needs that time to build its CIA organized and US people's unknowingly financed fighting power, officered by mercenaries, for example, the aborted Seychelles invasion of November 27, 1981, involved mercenaries based in South Africa, and soldiered, sailed and piloted by puppeted countries to attain a superior position over the Soviet Union or any other power, including even a possibly to be catalyzed supranational, individually thinking and acting, spontaneously cooperating amalgam of now majorly literate, apolitical world around citizenry. Since it takes millions of dollars to win US elections, now read billions, the vast majority of America's crossbreeding youth and an ever-increasing number of its adults concede politics to be so inherently corrupt as to cause increasing numbers of qualified voters to withhold from voting, lest in doing so their action be misconstrued as constituting their approval or acceptance of the present-day corruptibility of politics and its consequent inability to articulate the will of democracy. In 1980, of the 227 million persons in the United States, 159 million of whom were eligible to vote, only 78 million, or only 1/2, of the eligible persons voted in the most negatively momentous presidential election in nearly a third of a century. Of that number who voted, only 40 million voted for the winning candidate, Ronald Reagan. The overwhelming majority that President Reagan repeatedly claims legitimizes his mandate for sweeping executive and legislative change consists, in fact, of only 14% of the people of the United States. Many youth and many oldsters inspired only by So many youth and many oldsters inspired only by a concern for all Earthians and convinced that their voting cannot stem big money's will did not vote. On the other hand, the economically rich seeking to secure their economic advantage, for example, rich widows and retired executives, leave it to their lawyers, stockbrokers, or such organisations as the very minor minority organisation, immorally misrepresenting themselves as the moral majority, to make their voting decisions. Regarding such doing the thinking for others organisations as the moral majority, we have Yale University President A. Bartlett Giamatti's statement in August 1981, as quoted from a United Press International dispatch. He said that the moral majority and other conservative groups are shredding the spiritual fabric of our society and are intent on destroying diversity of union. They threaten through political pressure or public denunciation whoever dares to disagree with their authoritarian positions. They would sweep before them anyone who holds a different opinion. Giamatti further criticised the peddlers of coercion for pressing uncompromising attitudes that are dangerous, malicious nonsense, and as being advocates of polyester mysticism with a goal to divide in the name of patriotism. They have licensed a new meanness of spirit in our land, a resurgent bigotry that manifests itself in racist and discriminatory postures.
Wow.
That sounds so contemporary.
It sounds like he has no idea what's happening today. It's just all of that to the height of wow. And people are just buying into it and just acting like little automatons, you know? Whoa. Any other comments or questions?
I think it pays, people realize that it pays very much to confuse the little guy, you know, who is up against everything else, into surrendering whatever right that you have to exercise, let's call it freedom or your rights, you know, surrender them to third parties that in turn just represent, you know, the powerful, or that are constrained to express an opinion that is just in support of what has to be. And that's very difficult. I mean, I'm always overwhelmed by the thought of you as an individual. Take, for example, finance. You know, you have to make choices. And making choices in an environment where you are bombarded with all of this, much of it that is noise and has nothing to do with the reality of what you are facing. And you still have to make a choice in front of, against people that are organized with all of those legions of lawyers, advisors, specialists that are placating you with all of this argument. And you have to decide. How do you decide?
Wow. Any other comments, questions? I mean, I just listened to Jordan Peterson talking with, there have been 2 of his things in the last 7 to 10 days. One about COVID and what went on in universities to restrict legitimate conversation. And how somehow anybody who has a legitimate opinion but does not go with the status quo, whatever the corporate thing is somehow ostracized and is illegitimized by the system. And maybe it's just becoming so obvious that something can be done about it, but it's scary.
State of California has now passed a law that has stated that any doctor spreading disinformation can be disbarred.
Wow.
Hmm.
And yet few doctors are willing to talk about food as medicine. you know, take this pill. Don't eat broccoli. I can't tell you to eat broccoli, but I can tell you to take this pill. Jeez. Comments, questions?
It is scary how contemporary it is, but it's also interesting to see how the Soviet Union's propaganda machine actually worked too. As we're going through this, that's what I was thinking. You know, yeah, I mean, it was just interesting to see how they gave off a sense of economic might that we bought into, but the underlying message there is that how easily we can be fooled.
Yeah. And talking about that point, Joe, really, you know, how long did it take the Soviet Union to crumble?
Right.
He's talking about 1981. By 1985, the Soviet Union was almost gone. And
Right.
before 1990, gone completely. That is a mere 5 years, 6 years. Because he is referring here to Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense in the under Reagan. And he's talking about here 1981, 82, when his testimony in 1982, where he's saying that the Soviet Union is outpacing the US in the build of all of these submarines and all these things.
Yeah.
But before 1990, you know, the Soviet Union has crumbled.
Well, and if you look at what the Soviet Union is doing with its tanks, and I mean, he talked about tanks, what was it, 4-1 or 5-1 over US, and yet the Russian army just can't seem to handle it in Ukraine. Maybe that's just the propaganda we're getting, but their equipment doesn't work, and I don't know. Maybe it's just we're getting propaganda.
I think the lesson for the individual is that yes, get the information, but always being suspicious.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Don't ever become ideological about information that you receive. Because everything being cyclical, there's always a side that is hidden or that is distorted. You don't see it, but it's distorted on purpose because you just see it from one side.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Shall we continue?
John.
Yes.
Yes, we can certainly continue. The supranational giant-controlled Madison Avenue advertising billions at once replied through the editorial pages of its US newspapers, which undertook to vitiate the statement of Yale University's president. It is not likely that the third oldest and second richest university in America has a board of trustees and faculty that would select as its president an irresponsible crackpot, which many media editorials asserted Giamatti to be. Because many of the invisible supranational corporations' manufacturing facilities are presently located on US geography, and the invisible giants' armaments objectives require 10 years lead time, the Colossus has now, of necessity, placed its initial armaments orders in the US. That's what happened then. We're back, okay.
In the
US situated factories. Capitalism's supranational corporate colossus also finds it most convenient and invisibly expedient to continue doing its business under the name United States, which is easy for it to do effectively. First, quite simply by hoisting the American flag in front of all of its factories, and second, by pulling the vital strings of the finance-shackled and lobby-locked congressional puppets to make them pass the requisite legislation. Thus, the Colossus now, early 1982, has in production the necessary first things first of its ultimate 10-year, multi-trillion-dollar procurement, world published as being USA National Defense Activity. Throughout its first 127 pre-World War I years, the US government often had no national debt. World War I left the US with a national indebtedness of $33 billion. The US banking system went truly bankrupt in 1929, but the New Deal's 1933 bank moratorium postponed recognition of that fact. Since then, the moment of acknowledgement that the US government itself is financially bankrupt has been postponed, first by further and further ahead postponements of the payoff dates for US notes and bonds, and by successive votes of the US Congress to increase the national debt limit. By money accounting, in contradistinction to real wealth accounting, the US is now realistically bankrupt. Since Nixon became president, the US has been able to pay even the interest on its national debt, let alone reduce the principal. Before Nixon, Congress assumed tax underwriting of ever greater interest bearing on ever more postponed and greater national debt limits. For all the Nixon years and all the years of his successors, the president has had annually to file a negative budget, meaning the US cannot even pretend to be able to pay the interest on its indebtedness. Oh, wow. The supranational...
Is it not like today? What is it not like today?
This is, yeah.
Yeah, and to my point here is that Bucky wasn't an economist.
No.
But he comprehensively tackled issues. And that allowed him to have kind of, how would I call it? He could see things in a way that we wouldn't see if we just took a specialized corner of a pie. And that is, I mean, this is written in 1980, because he died in 1983 anyway. So his ghost couldn't write. But, you know, it so looks similar to what we have. I mean, the US was it last week or last month? Talking about the ceiling, the debt ceiling.
Right now.
Yeah.
What? I lost my thought. I'm sorry.
Well, they postponed the debt ceiling conversation until June or something like that, but it's constant. And every administration, every Congress has raised the debt limit. I think we're in the trillions of dollars. So, want to continue reading?
Yep. The supranational money colossus banking experts therefore have ordered its US 1981 president and its congressional puppets to legislate stringent budgetary measures without reducing Grunch's annual earnings, to be accomplished by curtailing old age medical aid and eliminating school children's lunches. Eyewash measures permitting the US government to technically assume that by 1983 it would be balancing its budget as a first requirement of sound banking practice, warranting the banks loaning their funds to accommodate the most profitable known business, that of armaments. However, by 1982, it became evident that the administration was not going to be able to do so, even within roughly a $100 billion deficiency. Balancing the budget would, in fact, be only a creditability cosmetic in view of supranational controlled international banking superabundant monetary capability to pay for the ultimate 6 trillion CIA's, capitalism's invisible armies, rearmament goal. If the supranationals are unable to accomplish a US budget balancing, then a consortium of the supranational only logos identified entities will use its own credit card banking system and comfortably charge off to ensure its 6 trillion armaments acquisition program. But they don't want to play the game in that profitless manner. They want to do it through US defense orders, which can pay handsome dividends throughout the process, making possible not only the continuance of all the corporation executives, but the refunding of their capital expenditures. $6 trillion. Let's try to sense the magnitude of that. 6 trillion happens also to be the number of dollars the US and the USSR have already jointly spent on armaments since the end of World War II, when the United Nations was established. All electromagnetic radiation travels at 186,000 miles per second. That is a little over 7 times around the Earth's equator in 1 second, over to the moon and back in 4 seconds, or over to the sun in 8 minutes. 6.5 trillion is the number of miles radiation reaches out radially in 1 year, traveling at 186,000 miles per second. That is the magnitude of the number of dollars the supranational corporations are now intent on spending, and they're spending exclusively on killingry, at the same time that old people are deprived of their security and children go lunchless. With control of the free world media, the Colossus hopes to postpone world realization of the fact of US bankruptcy for 10 years. Those 10 years constitute the time needed to complete their program of rearmament procured through US government machinery. Having attained its present military superiority, the USSR is not going to give the supranationals those 10 years to build their new offences. The USSR sought its superiority in order to force disarmament so that it could turn its vast industrial productivity to the benefit of its own people, to prove that socialism can demonstrate a higher standard of living than can capitalism. And knowing that capitalism is intent that the USSR shall never have the opportunity, knowing that capitalism is so intent, the USSR is probably going to try to force a conventional warfaring showdown long before the critical 10 years to regain parity opportunity is afforded to capitalism. Capitalism's recourse is to have its leaders move into the Rocky Mountains atomic bomb-proof apartments, then to push the button which ends it all for everyone. If you're upset by that, don't forget that critical path does offer a happy, but only by the skin of our teeth to be attained, out from the dilemma. Paper into gold alchemists.
Let's pause right there for a second, because that's a new chapter right there. So let's just pause for a second. I did some little checking. The US debt is currently $34 trillion, $31.46 trillion. That's the total amount of outstanding debt for the US. And I did some fact checking. My question was, what was the last president to balance the budget? And the US government suffered budget deficits every year from 1970 through 1997. Democrat Bill Clinton was the president in 1988 who, when the government finally recorded a surplus. There also were budget surpluses in 99, 2000, and 2001. 2001 was the last year that Clinton administration proposed a budget. Republican George W. Bush succeeded Clinton in 2001. The United States had a budget deficit in the year 2002 and has recorded budget deficits every year since then. The deficit is projected to increase substantially this year under Obama, whenever this was written. Republicans say they should get credit, at least some credit, for the budget balancing during the Clinton administration because the Republican majorities controlled both the House and the Senate. So there's a little update of what's gone on since then. Any other
Let,
comments? Go
let's
ahead.
just listen. Let's just listen to that narrative. It's all like political. But now let's look at the fact. When was Glass-Steagall?
1933,
No, when was it repealed?
71 I think under Reagan. It started to be piecemeal.
No,
19-
no, it was
1998.
1990, or it was like
1998, not 1990.
yeah,
1998. And when was the budget balanced? Once, like one impulse. And
It says here 4 years under Clinton, from 99 through 2001. 3 years.
no, it was 1 year.
2001.
It was just 1 year.
Yeah.
Thank
It
you
was
so-
all. So what happened? Let me give my speculation. What happened? It became very unsustainable in the 90s. So they lifted Glass-Steagall, that was still then nominally limiting the stuff, and they allowed the financialization of the debt. They allow that creativity will be used to give an illusion of budget balance. It doesn't exist. It has been a budget deficit since. And the truth, one of the manifestation of it is that if you look at the real wages of people, it's just been going down, Joe.
Right.
It's been going down. You know, remember 1998. After that, you start having the emerging market crisis. You have Greenspan coming. You have, you know, money printing that become, you know, exponentially, you know, expounded with Bernanke, and it's been like that to today. It hasn't changed. That's one point. The second point is that it seems like there's always, you know, we should always take with caution any declaration of war. The reasons that are given to declare war on a country or to start war at a place. It always looked to me like, if you look at history, it hasn't been true. You know, the masses have been misled to support a cause that is not really the cause. And it's sure, I mean, I don't know how we feel, but it's so dangerous.
I think you're right, Manu. I mean, you know, it was this dot-com bubble was about to burst, and they actually needed something to sustain the economy. And they turned to something that they had no idea what would be unleashed in 8 more years. And instead of letting, this is part of a greater theme, so instead of letting systems, letting things die and regenerate, that then it ends up costing more than you could ever have first imagined. And then so yeah, I mean, again, this is it goes back to Bucky and returning to nature.
I think instead of saying returning to nature, I will propose understanding comprehensively, or attempting to understand comprehensively for all the parties. And I'm talking here in the name of the individual. If we were educated, if we understood what was going on, maybe things might be different.
It's funny, you know, you're right, Manu. I mean, you have a math background and you understand more about economics than most economists. And there's something to be said for that. Something very deep. And my friend actually had told me not recently, but about a year ago, he said, you know, why is economics even a discipline? And he said, you know, it should be, you know, you have math and then you learn about the world and apply the math or apply logic to the world. You don't necessarily need it to be Now, I don't know if that's accurate, and I haven't thought through it enough. But you're right, having a comprehensive approach to the world allows you to look beyond the financialization of instruments. And I think that that's the important message in that as well.
I've just done a few Googles on Glass-Steagall, and I found them to be very, very interesting. The fact that Clinton, who balanced the budget, is the guy who signed the bill that terminated Glass-Steagall, although it had been dismantled over 10 years prior, starting in the 1980s, starting with Reagan, in fact, that it started to be dismantled one little bit at a time. And I find it to be really interesting. They say that the Glass-Steagall Act was to stop banks from being involved in high risk investments. That's the propaganda quote. Another one says that basically Glass-Steagall stopped banks from being both commercial and
Retail.
retail. So with Glass-Steagall gone, banks can buy commodities and hold on to them and speculate with them. And that's the
And
reason.
use depositors' funds.
And depositors' funds, they didn't have any limits on that. That's one of the things with the stress testing that they do now, they're supposed to have capital requirements.
Right. And so this is what enabled banks to buy houses, competing with American people. And so banks buy houses and store the houses as a high risk investment. And it's actually, they're just buying commodities and they're just competing with the American people. Go ahead.
And what was the story? I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to go to say that is even more sinister in that before, let's just take simple banking.
Right.
Steve, you have $100 you deposit in the bank. That $100 is your asset, is the bank liability, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The bank will take that $100 and write it as a reserve bank. That will become a bank asset, but the bank will have use, how do you call it? You know, the bank will have a right to loan 900, for example.
Right. It's
Fractional
leverage.
reserve.
Comes back to leverage.
Yes, they call it
Fractional reserve banking.
Yeah. Reserve.
what is that?
Reserve
Fractional
deposit.
reserve.
Fractional reserve banking. That was the whole stuff, and it worked like that as long as some guidelines were kept. What has happened is that in the classification, your deposit is no more your asset.
Right.
It's been technically moved down, right? To become from the onset the bank's asset. You know, when you deposit money in a bank, it's not your asset. There is a bond that is issued to you, right? Instead of you holding a real asset. And what has happened that the bank can now use that liberally to speculate.
Yeah.
Do you understand what has been made?
Yeah.
It is subtle, but it's very technical.
Mm-hmm.
Your asset has been moved down in the books of a bank. The bank, instead of that, has issued a bond, and you hold a derivative. That is your deposit. It's no more real. In other words, you could go to a bank one day and ask for your cash, and the bank doesn't pay your cash. Not that there's a bank run, but just by the fact that the bank has technically the ability to do so. John, am I wrong?
No.
I don't think so. I think the difference is that, as you say, the moment they convert it to a bond or something that's not a balance in an account, they then go and put it on the favourite in the last race, and the favourite loses and your bond becomes valueless.
Mhm.
So instead of having a credit to your account, they've mismanaged that. And the bond, it's a repeat, this same thing that JP Morgan was doing for decade after decade. talk the farmers into buying farm equipment and giving them finance. And then when times turn bad, you get to take their farm as well as the farm equipment. And
Developers did that too.
hmm?
Real estate developers and the way they
Oh, yeah,
structure
yeah.
their
There's
contracts.
that movie about the crash 2008 that makes you wince as you go and explore what they did.
And remember what the narrative was. The narrative was that property doesn't go down,
Oh, yeah, sure.
Mhm.
that the value.
Ask the farmers who lost their farms. Property
Yeah.
can go down in value. Of course it can. Always can.
There are people banking on it.
Oh,
So
Literally.
instead of property being property has started going up and down now. That is the thing, you know, like that's where the subtle changes. It was before I have resources, I exchange them for property, I get real property. That is which function is to shelter me. Now it becomes an instrument that is traded up and down. And that is, yeah.
Oh, no, please. I'm sorry. I cut you off.
No, go on. I'm true.
No, it brings up another thing that what is being done with the property. In other words, no value is being created. It's just going up and down based on a financial instrument.
Mm.
And that process, all that process, there's nothing moving forward. So the value of property becomes almost, you lose productivity. Oh, I hate to use that word, but yeah, you lose productivity in that.
well,
Because
there's no return. There's no income being generated. So if you've got property that's occupied or used and generating income, that's a different thing to vacant land sitting there.
right, but the value of it is dependent on some, mythical number.
Well, it depends if you look at it for return on investment. If it's got cash flow and you know what the cash flows and you know what the return on investment, that's a different way to look at it. But if it's a block of land.
But what happened when there is no cash flow, John? Like now, oversupply of property.
No, there's not residential, not in Australia, there's not. Rents are steadily rising. The average rent on a residential property in Perth in the last 2 years has increased from $400 per week to $600 per week.
Wow.
The vacancy rate in rental properties is 0.7%, less than 1% vacancy in residential rental properties.
And how much have the income increased, John? By how much? I mean, that is.
Well, in 2 years, it's gone up by 50%.
But the income of people, has it gone up or come down?
$400 a week. $400 a week. Other expenses have gone up, rates and insurance, but not by that sort of amount. Electricity's gone up, but the tenant will normally be paying that. I mean, we have an apartment, so the strata company has some expenses for electricity, but residential real estate in Australia generally produces a very poor return on investment unless you buy less expensive properties. But certainly the return on residential real estate in Australia, certainly in Perth, I know because I was reading the figures yesterday, has increased. As I say, the average rental income from a residential rental property in Perth has increased from $400 a week to $600 a week in 2 years.
Mm-hmm. But where I have problem, John, is this one. And in regard to Bucky, right? Bucky's proposition was that the cost of supply will come so much down that you wouldn't need to own. You would just become a renter. Because
that happens in Europe. It happens in Europe. I have a friend in Munich who rents an apartment from an insurance company. It's part of their long-term portfolio. He's rented that apartment for at least I met him 34 years ago, and even when he was moved interstate with his when he was moved internationally with his employment, he maintained that rental property for a couple of reasons. One is the rent's very reasonable and he's guaranteed lifetime tenancy. They're never going to sell it, and they charge a reasonable rent. And secondly, if he owned any real estate in Germany, the government would take 40% in death duties when he died. So for two reasons, the availability of long-term rental accommodation that you can have lifetime occupancy of, that's what we need. We need a pool of residential properties that are owned by superannuation funds or insurance companies as part of their investment portfolio. But first of all, accommodation, residential accommodation is too expensive, certainly in Australia, much less expensive in the United States, I believe, to build. But here we build very inefficiently in brick and tile, which makes the cost prohibitive for a start. And the building process is very inefficient. There's a lot of waste. So Bucky talked about houses being built in factories. We've bought a couple of transportable houses that are built in a factory and then delivered on site. That's a much more cost-effective way to build residential real estate. But in Australia, we have a shortage of residential real estate and the return is reasonable on some of it at the moment.
Mm.
We've got some residential properties that produce 5% per annum return.
But what about the income of the potential tenant? How fast has it increased?
It hasn't. In Australia, there have been some wage increases in the last 3 or 4 years, but they haven't kept up with inflation.
Yeah.
So the wage increases have not given more purchasing power. So a large, certainly now, a larger percentage of a family's income goes in accommodation and food.
So is more and more untenable. It's going to be untenable, even if it doesn't.
Fewer people are going to be able to afford it.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like the Singaporean model, where the Singaporean government allows you to borrow back your superannuation to buy your residence. That will struggle to get up in Australia. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad way. If you've got soundly run superannuation and you allow people, because what they've done in Singapore is realised the first prerequisite is people have security of accommodation. And also if they own their homes, they're less likely to riot and risk their accommodation. Once you have somebody purchasing their own accommodation, they have something to lose. When people have nothing to lose, they're much harder for governments to control.
Very interesting. I was looking at a couple of things. The housing issues are quite complex, and everything you said about Australia seems to be very, very similar in the States. The interesting thing to me, while there are discussions this way and that way and details that may vary, it's interesting how one of the big issues in America is that even though modular or prefabricated housing is more efficient, it's earthquake proof. It's, I mean, there's so many advantages to pre-built functions. The most communities in America will outlaw those things because they're trying to maintain the value of their property.
Wow.
And to the point where they legislate to eliminate low-income housing, eliminate anything that'll get their property values down, which is, it's just so amazing to me how the system is so upside down at every time.
And originally you couldn't borrow money. Originally the banks wouldn't lend on transportable housing, which managed to limit it anyway, because the banks had to say, all they had to say was, no, we won't lend, and you couldn't buy it.
Yeah, in fact, that's still the issue. Back 25, 30 years ago, Warren Buffett was all excited about prefab housing, and he bought Berkshire Company, which was big on prefabricated loans, and the feds just shut everything down. They did it with building codes. They've done it with all sorts of things, plus local communities.
It's the other way now. There's more and more transportable housing being built.
Right.
The banks will finance it.
Yeah.
I've got bank mortgages on 2 properties that are transportable.
Yeah. Elon Musk has even developed a little company. To change the conversation slightly, there is, I was doing a search here between banks and savings and loans. And about 10 years ago, I decided I was in 2 national banks. I was in Wells Fargo maybe I was in 3. Because I had these properties around, and I was trying to get things that were good for my renters to pay rent. I had US Bank, Wells Fargo, and I think I had Washington Mutual, which was a state bank, but then became nationalized. Well, over the last little while, I've gotten rid of all of my NA banks, and I'm totally in credit unions, which is a weird thing in America. I don't know if you guys have credit unions
We've
there.
got them, and they're very big, and a number of them have grown into banks.
Yeah. And as I look down here, the cons with banking with credit unions, this is a Google search. Membership restrictions. You have to be a member to borrow money. So this is a con, all right, which is crazy because you can be a member of any credit union. All you got to do is walk in the door and open up a savings account. That makes you a member. Limited number of locations, and then fewer services. And now savings.
The big banks are doing that anyway. The big banks are closing their physical branches right left and
Yes.
center.
Yeah. I mean, these are not disadvantages, right? It looks like propaganda to me. Get in credit unions. Anyway. 942, we could start doing chapter 5, and yet.
No, I think it's too late.
Yeah, I think so too.
There's too much in what we've just read, honestly. It's just.
Yeah, it's just overwhelming almost, isn't it? So let's start doing takeaways. Susan, how are you feeling, and what do you take it away from tonight?
So
Can you breathe? Can you breathe? This is the question.
Can I breathe? Yes, we got to keep moving forward. It's I guess it serves a function to have some understanding of all that's wrong. And I'm going to need to go dial back out to some of, continue looking for things that are hopeful. And so, Dee, thank you for the prompt to consider credit unions as one of those. Participation is something that's hopeful. Tomorrow, I think I'm going to go out to a local place that does fruit trees and see if apparently there's a Bermudan cherry tree that can handle full Arizona sun and makes amazing amounts of vitamin C. So I'm thinking of having at least some more moves to increase the actual regenerative value of my property. So that's my upside. And I do believe that we have to keep the faith that there's a way through all this. And Joe, how are you feeling, and what are you taking away? Because I know we got to get you to bed.
Yeah, not, my stomach is definitely letting me know it's there. But I feel very fortunate to have been here this evening. Thank you, John, for reading. I thought the conversation was incredibly fruitful in the sense that you think about it, we got perspectives from banking, we got perspectives from defense, we got perspectives from the medical profession, from Susan, what she experiences. And so and we got perspective on some of the key concepts that allows Bucky to do the analysis that he does, his cosmic accounting and things along those lines. So I'm very fortunate to have been here, and that is my biggest takeaway is the importance of comprehensivity within that framework. That's exactly what comprehensivism is about. It's about understanding the whole, not just looking at the parts. And we looked at a lot of different parts today, so I'm very fortunate to be here. So, John, how do you feel, and what are you taking away from the day?
I'm very glad that I've been part of today. I'm troubled by the content of today, which is just a reinforcement that there doesn't appear to have been any improvement, any progress. Governments and large corporations appear to be no less powerful or no less out of integrity than they were 40 years ago. So there doesn't appear to have been, Bucky was writing just over 40 years ago. Can't see any improvement of any significance, so that's a concern. Yeah, I suppose I'm troubled by what's happening around me. I'm curious to see what the result is. Anybody heard about the Nigerian elections? Nigeria is just going down, it's just going to the polls to elect a new leader. I think there are 3 main candidates, and the former president has had 2 4-year terms and is not standing. And Nigeria has so much potential and so many problems. Just hopefully it's a peaceful transition of power to somebody who has the majority of the votes. But we look at governments and elections and transitions and some of the things happening around the world, it is extremely troubling. So I can't do anything about it. I can only focus on what I can do something about. And that's hopefully first become better educated and aware myself, and then in very small ways make a difference around me. So it is better to know than to be ignorant. So I'm hopefully a little less ignorant than I was at the beginning of the call. So Manu, how do you feel? What do you take out of today?
I try not to be overwhelmed with feelings and things. Talking about Nigeria, you know, it's nice to see that 87 million out of 200 million people turn up for the elections. That's not too bad. And I hope that they will pronounce themselves in a way that makes sense, because lately in Nigeria, there was cash crisis. Payment of anything. Now, I feel very privileged, and I'm grateful for that we can discuss. We have a space where we can discuss issues in a way that is nice, that is almost tribal. You know, like, you know, we looking at issues of a tribe, and then we finding solution under the big tree or under the big teepee. So that is the nice side. Another thing that I see, I'm really amazed as how current are issues that Bucky dealt with 40 years ago. 40 years ago. It is so current. And I will say, I would recommend to anybody 3 books: Utopia or Oblivion, Critical Path, and Grunch of Giants. Because those 3 books, without being too technical, allow, I wouldn't say an individual, but a group of people to have insight of what is going on. What planet we're living on, and then what are the issues, and give a glimpse of window how we can solve this issue. And Bucky said here, he said, if it looks too gloomy, there is a hint of a possible solution if you read Grunch of Critical Path. I say he mentioned it, you know, John, you read it today. He mentioned something like that. So I just would not kind of be, you know, stop, I would say, promoting these books. They are difficult, but it's relatively difficult compared to synergetics. And we can, if we give enough effort, understand it. And the best would be if we can find a way to be able to transmit it ourselves in a simpler way, in a way that somebody can understand it. And then it will have an effect, at least on the person. So that's my big takeaway here, is to have these books as, you know, on my shelf, available all the time. I can consult them and I can discuss them the more I can. Otherwise, I'm thankful, I'm grateful. Steve, how do you feel? What do you take away?
Well, I'm really grateful for the call, and I'm shocked. I'm shocked at how I was pretty happy in this between the 60s and the 80s. I had no freaking idea how bad things were. I'm reading this book and find out how we went from the 60s with Oblivion or Utopia into the Grunch of Giants in the 80s, and how worse things have gotten since then. And that was a 20-year cycle. This is a 40-year cycle. In the 80s, a presidential election was 50 million. Today, last year, it was 1.4 billion. That's almost 40 times.
4.1.
1.4 billion, yeah. Or was
Oh,
it
you said 4.1 earlier.
Did I? Then I remembered 1.4. I wrote down 1.4, whatever. And the national debt was around 900 million in the 80s, or a trillion, roughly a trillion. Now it's $34 trillion. I mean, it was bad in the 60s. It was worse in the 80s, and it's even worse today. And yet, maybe I'm just lucky. Maybe I'm just lucky because I feel so blessed. And my big takeaway is, okay, it sucks, but the music created in the 60s and 70s was the best music ever. Classic rock rules. So, wow, what a world we live in. What is this experience of being a human being? And when do I wake up? And when do I stop playing into their hands? And yet I guess I play my own hand and I'm okay. And I let all this waste and all this usurpation of ephemeralized efficiencies go to the 1% or the 0.5%. It boggles my mind. I have hope for humanity. I think that just like computers were supposed to be designed back in the old days to control the economy and help corporations win, and then all of a sudden computers win on every desktop, and it kind of democratized the computer thing. And I think what's happening with social media, we're either making national governments irrelevant, or they're going to blister everybody when they go out of, I don't know. It's hard. I asked Susan, are you able to breathe? I'm having trouble breathing as I think about all this stuff. Wow. Okay. And so my takeaway is the best music came out of the 60s and 70s. So that's my takeaway.
One of the other points of hope is when I'm reading Bucky, he said he didn't think the Soviet Union would allow that 10-year thing. So Bucky was kind of predicting Armageddon by the 90s. And here we're in the 2020s. So there has been this hopeful little thread.
Yes. Yeah. Just before you go, Joe, you don't look comfortable at all. Joe, have you ever tried fasting?
I'm definitely fasting now.
Yeah, I was going to say 24 hours at least with just water. Just let your system.
Well, it's
clean
even the
itself
water isn't going down. Hey,
So
Hello, Ann.
hey, Ann, how are you doing? We were just doing our farewells, and so we're glad to ask you.
I'm
How
so
you
sorry
feeling?
because there's an event
Hello.
we just did the launch of our biosphere. I forgot today was Sunday.
Yay!
I'm so sorry. And so
Can
there's
you
a
pass?
whole-
Can you pass one of those
around
through the Zoom? Never mind.
That's the lunch of what you say?
I think I heard biosphere, but
Yes, the biosphere. So we've got all our students here, a whole lot of things going on. Yeah, so it's the launch of our biosphere. I forgot today was Sunday.
Wow.
Time to say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
love you.
Perfect timing, Ann.
Yeah, I'll be there next week. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
You're my takeaway today, Ann. Out of all the people you're reading, you're the takeaway. Thank you. Bye-bye,
Thank
everybody.
you, Ann.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Take care.